Okay, so last week we did these trends, or we started on these 20th century trends, the first one being suburbanization. The next one we're going to look at is segregation. Okay, and we'll look at the overall trends, the causes, consequences, and potential solutions. So here you have a racial dot map of Los Angeles, and where each dot corresponds to a racial group as defined by government agency. I forget the government agency that makes the racial groups, but it's a government agency that kind of define these groups. So yellow is Hispanic, blue is black, red is white, and green is Asian. So this is what um, Los Angeles looks like. And you can see there are some segregation patterns where certain groups are concentrated in certain areas, but then we also have areas with that are fairly mixed. So there's this area over here, this area right here. This is Culver City. Over here near UCLA is fairly mixed. I believe this is downtown. You can see is fairly mixed as well. This area right here, kind of in between Hawthorne and Gardena, is fairly mixed. All right, this is the general patterns though. So you can have cities that look like LA that have areas of segregation, but also kind of more diverse areas, and you can have cities like Chicago, which are very segmented, where you can see, you could basically see the dividing lines almost kind of jump out at you. All right, and then here are kind of two links that kind of where you can play around with this. You can look at different cities. You can look at their evolution over time. All right, so the first thing we do is, well, how do we measure? How do we measure segregation? So the primary way it's measured is through this dissimilarity index, and this really only works with two racial groups. So you basically have to pick two racial groups, and this will give how segregated are those groups in a city. And basically, the way it works is you divide a city into neighborhoods, where each neighborhood is indexed as I. So I is a neighborhood, and then you have big N numbers of neighborhoods. So if you have, say, you divide your city into 8 sub neighborhoods, you'll have 8 of these. 1 through 8, and then your two groups are Group A and Group B. Okay. And then what you do is take the population of Group A in the ith area. So say you're doing the first neighborhood, what is the population of this group A in that area? And then you divide it by the overall population. Same thing with Group B. And then there'll be the difference between the two, the absolute value of the difference. You sum all these for each neighborhood and multiply it by 1/2, and that gives you a dissimilarity index. This number will be between 0 and 1. So perfect integration, for instance, say your city is half black, half white. Perfect integration would give you a value of 0 on this. So our first neighborhood will basically be our first neighborhood will have same proportion of white as it does black. Therefore, we'll get 0 here, and so on. If it's a perfectly segregated neighborhood, basically what we're going to get is this will all of these will sum to 2, and then we'll get 1 as this. Okay, we'll go through an example of this in the discussion section. All right, but for now you should just know how to calculate it, and basically it's between 0 and 1, where 0 is perfectly integrated and 1 is perfectly segregated, meaning one neighborhood is one group, the other neighborhood is another group. Okay. All right. And so generally, social scientists have kind of said cities that are between 0 and 0.3 are integrated, between 0.3 and 0.6 are moderate, and then 0.6 and 0.1 are heavily segregated. So the overall trends is we do have increasing segregation from 1890 to 1940 during the first wave of the Great Migration. And so our dissimilarity index goes on for American cities goes from 0.5 to about 0.7. This intensifies during the 1970s as we have more white flight and more suburbanization of whites. And then it peaks in 1970. And then since 1970, it has been falling. So since 1970, our cities have become less segregated. Okay. So these are the overall trends. This is the dissimilarity index, and then there's another measure of segregation called the isolation index. So you can see kind of this, it's going up until 1930, kind of plateaus and increases by a little till 1970, and then has been falling rather rapidly since then. This is another way to look at it, where since 1970, this is the average, the middle of these boxes. And then this is the 75th percentile and the 25th percentile. So what this can show you is that, okay, cities on average have been becoming less segregated, but we still have very segregated cities. So you still have, this is 75th percentile. So you still have 25% of cities that are heavily segregated. And then you have some cities that are just incredibly integrated down here, but you still do have some cities that are very, very, very segregated. You know, the Chicago example being one. If you hold the MSAs consistent, because kind of cities change their borders, this is what it looks like. Okay. All right. So next up, we're going to talk, what are the causes? Okay. So what are the, the big factors that lead to segregation? So you may have probably learned about many of these in other classes. We will go through them one by one. So one potential explanation is just that there are ethnic enclaves, that groups want to live together. And so this leads to kind of naturally having some enclaves. So this will take the form of Black self-segregation, where Black people just want to live in one neighborhood all together, okay? And so looking at research, most Black people prefer a neighborhood that's 50-50 Black, white. And the average Black respondent prefers to live in a neighborhood that's more integrated than their current one. So what this would suggest is this is not a good explanation, because according to survey data, Blacks would prefer to live in more integrated neighborhoods than they do on average. So there must be some sort of barriers keeping them from moving to those more integrated neighborhoods. So this is our first explanation, but it's not, we don't think it's going to be a driving explanation. So we can just kind of put this out there to say this is, something that is discussed, but it's usually dismissed by the literature. So if Blacks would prefer to live in more integrated neighborhoods, what is keeping them out? Well, in the initial period, there is collective action. So this can take there's like formal collective action, like using the government to keep Blacks out of neighborhoods. And then there is informal collective action. So it first takes place with formal collective action, where cities basically legislate segregation. They say this area is zoned for whites only. This is ruled illegal. So then you have more private action where there are racial covenants. So houses are not allowed to be sold to non-white races. Okay, so this is an example of one. Okay, so this is oftentimes will exclude both Blacks and Jews. So you have these restrictive racial covenants. So it takes place at the city level initially, and then at the individual level, these are sort of written into the deed of the house that when it's sold, it's not allowed to be sold to a non-white. These are eventually ruled illegal in 1948. So if you have a house that was built before 1948, you can actually go look at the deed to see if at one point it did have a racial covenant in it. Okay, so you have like sort of legal methods at the city level via zoning, and then at the individual level via these contracts. Those are both ruled illegal. So then there are other tactics that are more informal. So you just have more informal and illegal. So you just have more harassment, so vandalism, cross burning, bombing, death threats. You could have it via an arm of the state, where there are police harassment of Black people in certain parts of the town. So that still takes place even to the present. And then you have, so there's just examples, use the famous examples of Percy Julian, who's named the Chicagoan of the Year. And the same year he's named the Chicagoan of the Year, when he tries to move to a white neighborhood, his house is firebombed. We have 200 attacks on Black homeowners in the Detroit area. Okay, so this is basically collective action You could think of it as the methods used by whites to keep blacks out of predominantly white neighborhoods. And so this takes a variety of forms, using the state itself and then down to vigilante activity. Then there are more federal policies. These are the often ones that are discussed, if you take other classes. So the one that is mentioned the most is the is redlining, which is essentially the mortgage policies of that were codified during the Great Depression. So when the Great Depression happens, many households go into default on their mortgage, and the federal government takes over the loans. So the federal government goes into cities and says, "Are we going to take over this loan or not?" And basically, what they're trying to assess is, will the person be able to ultimately repay the mortgage? And they divide the city into areas that they think are risky and areas that are less risky. So these in the green areas, they think, okay, people will be able to repay the loan, so we are going to buy those loans or take those loans over from the private lenders. Now, and then the redlining, the areas that are deemed red, are too risky. We're not going to take those mortgages over. Okay, so here's the map of LA. These are areas that are deemed risky. These are areas that are deemed safe, and then in between. Okay, now these areas that are deemed risky are usually Black or ethnic neighborhoods. So it's important to think of that redlining. Work by Schertzer and Walsh show that redlining didn't produce segregation. It just codified it. Basically, this segregation was already existing. They just codified it by not extending loans or not taking over loans in this area. Although it should be noted that actually the government was more likely, actually twice as likely, to take over a Black mortgage and offer Black mortgages once they started offering mortgages with the FHA than private lenders. So this redlining basically codifies segregation, and then going forward, it kind of sets this in stone by when cities build outward, when they build suburban developments. Oftentimes, these mortgages would be guaranteed by the federal government for these suburban developments under the proviso that the developments were for whites only. Now, as I mentioned, the FHA would once FHA starts to guarantee mortgages and offer mortgages, they're more likely to give mortgages to Black households than private lenders were previously. But Black households are much, 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 much less likely to get mortgages than white households, and so then it becomes more difficult for Blacks to purchase housing, and because the housing in the white neighborhoods is more expensive, it becomes virtually impossible for Blacks to move into white neighborhoods unless they are incredibly wealthy, much more wealthy than their white counterparts. So basically, it codifies segregation here, and then it limits the ability of Blacks in these red line neighborhoods to move into other neighborhoods. I mean, essentially, it's more difficult for them to get mortgages and move into these areas. And then once new areas open up in the suburbs, those become white only areas via these discriminatory mortgage policies. So I think the story is a little bit more complex than is usually told. Although I don't know what goes on in other classes. Okay, then there is white individual action. We'll take a break and we'll cover white individual action.